All right, thanks for joining me today to find out a little bit about what your DNA can actually say about you. I wanted to bring this topic up because I think it's really an interesting topic to explore, because so many folks have engaged in sending in their DNA to a variety of companies, and I think it's particularly important to discuss what those results from these different companies can tell you, and maybe more importantly, what they can't tell you. Okay, and so let's proceed and find out a little bit about direct-to-consumer testing. So first of all, what is meant by direct-to-consumer testing? Well, what I mean by this, and to be clear, this is really the only type of genetic testing I'm talking about today. I'm not really going to wander into genetic testing that might be done through a physician, which would be more thorough than the direct-to-consumer testing. So we're really only talking about companies that you're likely familiar with, like 23andMe is a big one. And so I'm talking about circumstances where the individual provides their genetic material and there is no healthcare provider involved whatsoever here. So 23andMe is a common one. Ancestry DNA is a pretty popular direct-to-consumer company. There's a lot of them, actually. These are probably two of the most commonly used. There are others that you might be less familiar with, like cryogenics. So in these circumstances, and another one called Veritas. Okay, these two, Veritas and cryogenics, are direct-to-consumer in that you provide the sample yourself, you order the kit, and provide your DNA to these companies. But they're somewhat different in that some of them, like these last two, do actually require a healthcare provider to sign off in order for you to get your results. I'm, again, today mostly talking about the 23andMe's and the Ancestry DNA's type companies that are out there. Okay, so why are we interested in this? Well, lots and lots of folks have submitted their genetic information, right? And there's data out there. There's a lot of literature talking about folks who have received their direct-to-consumer information, and so I think it's interesting to review it. And when I say lots, I mean a lot. More than 26 million people have submitted their own sample to one of these companies for an analysis. And so in this graph here on the left, we see data from 2018. There's a PhD scientist who's kind of made it their hobby to follow this sort of information. So this is her data. And on the y-axis, you see number of people in the millions. And then each color represents a different company. So Ancestry DNA has kind of led the way, closely followed by 23andMe, and then some others that you might have heard of or might not. Family tree DNA is another popular one. On the right now we see data representing going out into the next year, into 2019. And so we see a strong still rise in the numbers on the right. The last data point that's indicated on this graph is April 20, and that data is not yet available. And I'm real curious to check back in and see what that data is going to look like, because about 10 days ago or so, and you may have seen this in the news, 23andMe is experiencing a decline in sales. And as a result of that, they've actually are planning to, or maybe have already, laid off about 14% of their employees. So it may be that we start to see that sort of turn the corner and begin to either flatline or go down a bit. And the reasons for this are not known, but it may range from, privacy issues, or who knows exactly why that might be happening, right? But nevertheless, millions of people have submitted their DNA from around the globe to these companies. So the question then is, what happens when you spit in a tube and send it into one of these companies? What happens to your sample? The first thing that happens is the DNA is extracted, and that's what you see in this image here, is some DNA that's being sort of spooled up in that tube. Maybe you had an occasion in your lifetime to experience extracting DNA. Commonly, we see science fair projects extracting DNA from strawberries or onions or whatnot. And DNA, in that sort of circumstance, you can quite quickly see that it's very white in color. It's rather stringy, kind of snot-like, right? And so extracting the DNA from the cells is, of course, the first step. Now, most of these companies, and especially the ones that we're really focusing on today, use what's called autosomal DNA for testing, as opposed to something else like mitochondrial or Y chromosomal DNA. Now, let's just take a minute to remember what we mean by autosomal DNA. So recall that each of us inherits approximately 50% of our genetic material, our DNA, from each parent, right? And so that genetic material is contained on chromosomes. So the DNA is on the chromosomes are composed of DNA, and we receive 23 chromosomes from one parent and 23 from the other. And each of us then has 46, typically 46 chromosomes. There's some variation here, but typically each human has 46 chromosomes. And 2 of those chromosomes are called sex chromosomes, and they are either X or Y. And again, those are excluded here from this testing. The other 23 pair are not sex chromosomes, rather we call those autosomes, right? So that's the type of DNA that's being analyzed by 23andMe and Ancestry and such. They're not looking at Y chromosomes, they're not looking at X chromosomes, and they're also not looking at DNA from what are called mitochondria, which are structures inside cells that possess their own DNA. Okay, so they're just looking at autosomal DNA, and what they're looking for is little markers, which we call SNPs, or more commonly called SNPs. So, what's a SNP? Well, SNP or SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. Right? So again, let's remind ourselves, what is that? What is a nucleotide? In the diagram here, you see some letters, A, T, G, and C. And those letters represent what are called nitrogenous bases. So DNA is composed of a sugar called deoxyribose, a phosphate group, and then nitrogenous bases. So one sugar, one phosphate, and one of these bases complexed together is called a nucleotide. And because the sugar and the phosphate are common, the DNA is usually represented by the base. So in other words, each of these A, T's, and G's, and C's can be arranged in a variety of orders. And so far as we know, all organisms on the planet possess DNA made of these 4 nitrogenous bases. So for many, many years, we've been able to determine the sequence, the order of these bases. And in recent years, with the technology improving so rapidly, we've been able to do this much more quickly. Right? So in 2003, humans were able to sequence our own DNA in its entirety for the first time, and it took many, many years and many millions of dollars. And now we can sequence our DNA overnight in some cases, right? So the technology has improved just dramatically. So back to the idea of a SNP. A SNP is where we see a difference. So polymorphism means many changes or many differences. So in this example, the individual at the top has an A at a particular position. The individual at the bottom has a G. So that would be a difference between these two folks, right? So what these companies do is they scan an individual's DNA typically for hundreds of thousands of these changes. And so what this slide depicts is some of this data. I'm just showing this to you to show you how they do this. And so you're looking for these changes across individuals. Now, it's important to remember that these companies are only looking at these changes. Right? They have a certain number of SNPs maybe 600,000, that they're going to look at, and that's it. They're not going to look at the rest of the DNA. And that, again, that's really critical to recall. So they use these markers, these SNPs, for things like determining, allegedly, your ancestry. So we can, first step to determining ancestry is to figure out the SNPs for the entire genome of the individuals who submitted their sample. Now, the word genome now refers to all of the genetic information from the person, so all of the person's autosomes. And then those SNPs, those results, that pattern of SNPs is compared to other folks who have submitted their DNA to the company. Okay? So for example, maybe the pattern that I have submitted, or from the DNA that I submit, indicates 50% European, 25% African, 25% Asian, 5% unknown, let's just say. Well, how do they know that? How do they actually determine that? Well, ancestry results that are delivered by these companies are determined using something called admixture analysis, maybe more accurately or appropriately known as biogeographical ancestry. But if you read about these things on the interwebs or somewhere else, they'll tell you that it's admixture analysis. What is admixture, right? What does that even mean? Well, it means just what I told you. It's the use of this SNP data to infer where an individual is from, their geographical origins. So the way they do this is they take samples from lots and lots of folks, and they cluster them by similarity and create like a data set of all of these samples. Right? And then when somebody submits their data, a new sample, which is not in that big data set, then they compare it to their existing cluster analysis, and they calculate what percentage of the DNA looks like one group and what percentage looks like another group. So just to give you a flavor for this, I want to show you a clustering from admixture analysis. This is from a paper that was attempting to look at folks in the Western Balkan region. And so this paper actually analyzed only 70 people, and they looked at 660,000 autosomal SNPs from 70 people, and they were able to create this particular cluster analysis from this data. Right? And so again, what you're seeing then is we have a cluster that represents Africa, a cluster that represents Asia, and the data looks different, as is indicated by the color. So now if I submit my data to one of these companies, it's compared to all of the data that currently exists, and the company will then provide me with something like this. On the left, we have one company's sort of ancestral results, and on the right another, but they're very similar in what they tell you, right? They, for example, say you're 99.3% European and 0.7% Asian and Native American, right? Then, in both cases, what they attempt to do is they attempt to break down what part of Europe these results are representing, right? As it turns out, most of what has evolved in the literature indicates that these ancestry results are quite good with respect to continent, but less so with respect to region within a continent. Okay? So when you look at this, you have to remember that the results are completely dependent on the data set that exists at that company. So different companies are going to have different data sets because different folks have created that data set. What this means is direct-to-consumer DNA testing is accurate. In other words, they're looking at SNPs, they're comparing the data to their existing data set. But what this says is it's probably not consistent, or what we might call precise. So in summary, you could say it's factual but not consistent, or it's accurate and not precise. Another way of saying that, right? And I can demonstrate that to you by sharing with you a science reporter sent her DNA into a handful of different companies, and she found that although there is some consistency, she gets a pretty wide range of results from different companies. And again, that reflects the company's data set, right? So the 23andMe folks, for example, said she's British and Irish, and then broadly Northwestern European. Folks from Ancestry DNA say, oh, nope, you're all British and Irish. This is confounded a bit by these companies don't use similar terminology necessarily, right? And so it's a bit difficult to interpret. But clearly GINA 2.0 said she was from Southwestern Europe. So definitely some mixed messages, as it says at the top there. Okay. So in the long game here, recall or know that ancestry analysis may change over time, which is very confusing for folks, right? They submit their DNA 5 years ago and they were a certain amount, they thought Irish, and then, they get an updated report 5 years later and they're no longer Irish. How could that be? Well, all that really reflects is as more and more individuals submit their DNA, the data set changes, and therefore your results will change. Okay? And so really what we're representing with these ancestry analysis is we're illustrating that humans have migrated and have mixed, and all sorts of historical things have likely happened. And so it's important to recall that the results that an individual gets might be different than what they expected. Okay. All right. So ancestry analysis is one thing. Another thing that these companies like 23andMe and Ancestry do is they can look for your relatives. And in fact, they often call them relative finder or whatnot. And so this testing is really good, actually, at detecting things like parents, siblings, cousins, etc. So sort of a generic relative result might look something like this. So you have an uncle that's also in the database, another relative, a fourth cousin that's in the database, etc. The thing to remember about these results is that currently, and with many of these companies, you have to actually opt out if you don't want to know about your family relationships. Some of these companies have actually been criticized because their default is opt-in, right? And so if you don't want to know, probably be really cautious about opting out, or maybe don't even submit your DNA to begin with. There are multiple stories that you can find where folks become distressed. They find out they're adopted. They find out that they have a sibling they didn't know about, and one of their parents has a whole other family. I mean, there's some really traumatic stories. There's also great stories where people find somebody they've been looking for, right? So it goes both ways, but it's important to recall that this is a possibility. For example, people share all sorts of stuff on the interweb, so I was able to find this result, and I try to block out folks' identities so we can't see them. But see, look here, this is a real report. So this individual's son and daughter have both shared their information, and as anticipated, their offspring have 50% of their DNA shared with the individual for whom this report is. And then we have a variety of other relationships, right? So if you do not opt out, you may open up your relative profile and find folks on there that you didn't know exist. So it's just something to keep in mind, right? Okay, so we've got Ancestry, we've got relative finding. Probably the biggest one and the one that is most interesting to folks that may be in this community is the direct-to-consumer health testing. And boy, this is an interesting area. And so far, one of the bigger companies to be involved in this sort of health testing is 23andMe. And so you can see there's a variety of conditions that they're going to test for. They're sort of stumping all the time to get more added to this list. All right, so let's take a look at this. First of all, recall that the folks who are getting this information back from these companies do not have a health care provider or a genetic counselor involved at all. So first of all, they may not even know what a lot of this stuff is, right? I mean, do you think that the average human knows that G6PD deficiency is actually a form of anemia? Probably not. So right away at the outset, we've got some sort of, confounders here. But at any rate, these companies or this company in particular is going to assess disease risk for these things. How do they do that? Well, they use SNPs again. They are going to look for single nucleotide polymorphisms that are changes in genes that have been previously identified. So this time, the company is using something that's known, right? But recall or know that they're only looking again at these certain SNPs. So this is something to keep in mind. So what they're really saying is that there might be a presence, or maybe there's something missing, of a variant, some change, that could affect the risk of disease over the course of the life of an individual. But again, I can't overstress this enough. It's only these variants that they're looking at. And many of these conditions involve lots of things, right? So they're only looking for a handful of changes or SNPs. So let's say that an individual receives a report and they find out they have one of these variants or they don't have one of the variants. Does that mean that this patient will develop something like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or that G6PD thing? No, it doesn't. And this is what's so important for the public and folks who are receiving this information to know. It's pretty scary, right, to think that. All that this data means is you have that one variant that the company was searching for that may increase the risk of disease. That's all it means. Take an example here. There's a variant that has this particular designation. It's in something called the GBA gene, and that variant is going to triple the risk of Parkinson's disease. That's pretty scary, isn't it? Triple the risk of a particular disease? Well, it is scary until you realize the baseline risk of an individual developing Parkinson's over their lifetime is 0.3%. If you triple that, that's really only a 1% risk. That's way less scary, right? Now, does it mean that you're not going to develop Parkinson's? No, it just means that you have this one variant. Other factors matter. And one of the big ones is if you have known affected family members, right? So, let's just say that a risk is found. 23andMe sends a patient or sends an individual a result saying that they have a particular variant or they're missing a particular variant. What should a person do? A person should confirm this result with a healthcare provider right away before they freak out or get scared or whatnot. But again, this is not a known thing, right? Folks are wandering around with their 23andMe information, maybe not having done this step, which is really, really important. The reason it's really important is because the literature has cast some doubt on these direct-to-consumer testing companies. So I'm going to share an article with you from Genetics in Medicine from 2 years ago in 2018. And now, mind you, I recognize that they were only looking at 49 test results, so the N is quite low, perhaps, but it is worthwhile to note that the findings from these direct-to-consumer companies were confirmed a little over half the time, but that means a little less than half the time there were false positives. And on the right here are some of the genes in question. And so you probably recognize the breast cancer genes, the BRCA1 and 2. And so this just absolutely reinforces the notion that if an individual receives information from one of these testing companies that they carry one of these variants, it needs to be confirmed. What about the opposite scenario? If your genome test comes back and all is clear, then you're good, right? You can go out, start smoking, doing whatever you want. Doesn't make a difference. Stop going to the doctor. No, don't do that. It turns out that genes do account for a considerable amount of risk for really rare conditions. But most of the conditions that 23andMe is going to be checking you for, a lot of the risk, if not most of the risk, is either not genetic at all, or it's linked to genes that they weren't testing for, it's environmental, it's actually likely multifactorial, right? Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, many of these things have such a multifactorial sort of makeup that just knowing one or two variants doesn't really tell a patient much of anything. Let's look at Alzheimer's, for example. It's in the news a lot lately. So the variant, and in genetics, another word that might be used for variant is allele, right? And so that means it's like chocolate, right? Let's take chocolate, for example. Chocolate comes in milk chocolate, white chocolate, dark chocolate. Those are all variants or alleles of chocolate, okay? So in the early 90s, folks studying Alzheimer's disease found one of these variants, one of these alleles called APOE 4. And that is the one that they're testing for in many of these tests. So what we know is that if an individual has one of these variants, meaning they got it from one parent, they do appear more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. If an individual has two of them, then the risk is increased. So, what does that mean? Well, really all it means is this variant is the predisposing factor. It is a predisposing factor, right? But look at folks who have this variant. You'll find out that lots of individuals live for a very long time, even carrying two copies of this variant. So that tells us that there have to be other things involved. Environment, diet, where you live, things that we don't fully understand yet, right? And so this is a great example of a variant being a predisposing variant. It doesn't predestine the individual who has to get the disease at all. It's just a risk factor. And maybe there is some clinical utility. Maybe if you know you have APOE 4, you get screened more often. You do more word puzzles. You eat more blueberries. Maybe there are small things that people could do, but the clinical utility of knowing this is somewhat questionable, especially when you look at this, right? This is a timeline here of Alzheimer's, and so you see in 92, before we had genome-wide association studies, which is the technology that allows us to look at lots and lots of DNA at once. In 92, they identified APOE 4, right? And then when genome-wide associated screening sequencing came on board, we started to find out that, look, there's lots of other genes involved, right? In 2009, 11, and 13, they started finding more and more genes that maybe play a role, and then following up, even more disease-relevant variants, etc. So I show you this image from the Lancet here to show you that there's a lot that underlies this disease. And that's true for most of the diseases on that list. Okay? So, in in the end, especially with the healthcare testing, before you send in your spit, remember, you cannot undo this. You cannot squeeze that genie back into the bottle. There's a fellow at Stanford who's a law professor who studies the intersection of biotechnology and law, and he says, if it bothers you, if it offends, if you're worried about what might be in there, you shouldn't sign this contract. You shouldn't do this test because you can't not know. And additionally, with this direct-to-consumer testing, all of this information is coming back to the individual through email, right? So finding out online might not be ideal. Take this example. This woman says, I had just gotten home from the gym. I opened the email for 23andMe. It changed my life forever. It said I had BRCA1. She says she broke into tears. She then did the thing that I suggested. She went and had that confirmed. And when she had that confirmation done, she said she was devastated because it did come back that she did in fact have the BRCA1 gene. But you have to notice that she says that talking to someone on the phone or talking to them in person was like night and day. She said that having someone talk her through the report versus just getting an email made a huge difference. Okay? So that's another piece of this to consider. Now, is all DCT or DTC bad? Absolutely not. There's some fun and entertaining things in this direct-to-consumer testing as well, particularly 23andMe. They do some really interesting stuff. They will send you trait reports, and they will show you if you're more likely to be bitten by a mosquito, or if you didn't already know it, if you were afraid of heights, for example. They'll show you your ability to match musical pitch, or whether or not your hair is going to fade when you go out into the sun. Now, this is fun, it's entertaining, but again, if I received this, and for example, I got that I had the ability to match a musical pitch, I would be just astonished, right? Because I definitely know that I don't. And so, much like the results from Ancestry and from the health testing, there is some variability here. Right, and this should be taken exactly for what it sounds like, just sort of entertainment, etc. Okay. So before we get done here, we should talk a bit about privacy. So there is information to be known here. First of all, many of these companies do sell their data to pharmaceutical companies. The most notable one is in 2018, 23andMe inked a huge deal with GlaxoSmithKline. So the DNA that has been submitted is being used by that pharma giant in their work. Some share their data. Some of these companies share their data with law enforcement. This was a particularly high profile when we got news that the Golden State Killer was captured, as some of his family members had submitted their DNA, right? So by and large, if you're a law-abiding citizen and whatnot, this should be a good thing, but it's just something to keep in mind, right? The public has a variety of interests. And then lastly, your data could be hacked. I think this is no more clear than lately with some of the big breaches, the Equifax breach, etc. And what about DNA? Does somebody want to hack DNA? Well, a couple of years ago, they found 92 million accounts from a company called MyHeritage on a private server. So fortunately, nothing seemed to have been done with that data, but it certainly illustrated that it can, in fact, be hacked, as all of this data can be. There is something called the GINA Law in the U.S. that it's useful to know about. There is an analogous law in Canada that came online about the same time. It's called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Okay, that's what GINA stands for. And this GINA Law, which came into existence in 2008, prohibits genetic discrimination in health insurance and in employment. So your DNA can't keep you from getting a job, and it can't keep you from being insured for health insurance. But it's good to know that the GINA Law does not protect against discrimination for using your DNA against you for life insurance, disability insurance, or long-term care. So just going into this with eyes wide open about what exactly is protected and what isn't is always a good thing, right? All right, so as we wind this up, so what can your DNA say? And again, I want to stress that I am only talking about this direct-to-consumer testing. I'm certainly not talking about testing that might be done at a healthcare facility where they look at all of the DNA, right? Because one of the things about DTC testing is they're only looking for certain markers, and they're ignoring everything else that might be in there, right? So what can we say? We can say it can likely indicate where your DNA is found today, which might give you some idea about your ancestry. And that's accurate to continent, probably. It can absolutely allow you to locate close relatives, and it can detect SNPs associated with some disease. It can also detect interesting traits. Do you have wet earwax? Do you have dry earwax? You're going to get bit by mosquitoes, etc., right? But it is a limited thing. Now, as time goes by, and it becomes more cost-effective to sequence the entirety of an individual's genome and look at all of the sequence, then things will shift, and we'll come back together and talk about that. But right now, for $99 or $200, you can have your SNPs analyzed. If you wanted to have your entire genome sequenced, there is a company, in fact Veritas, that one that I talked about at the beginning, will do it. It costs $600, and it does require a healthcare provider to be involved. But as time goes by, that will get less and less expensive, and things will probably begin to shift. Okay. All right, well, thanks for joining me today, and if you have any questions, send me an email, let me know.